Hello, everyone. This is Chris Judge for the Archaeological Society. It's October. It's Archaeology Month 2020. And our theme this year is Avocational Archaeologists. And today I'll be conducting an interview with my good friend, Ernest Helms, the third. MD, we call him Chip. That's what most people know him as. And I'm going to ask him a series of questions about how he got himself involved with all of these archaeologists. And what you're going to come to find out, he's been at it longer than I have, and I've been at it a good long time. And, so here we go. Good morning, Chip.
Good morning, Chris.
The first question for you is, how and when did you discover South Carolina archaeology?
My gosh, I don't know. As long as I can remember, we grew up on a farm in eastern Darlington County along the bluffs along the PD River. And I remember when I was 5 and 6 and 7 years old, we would go out to certain areas of the farm that had a lot of prehistoric artifacts and pick up arrowheads and pottery. So this goes way back before I even began grade school.
So you began by, tell us about Big Edward Swamp.
Edward Swamp was part of a tract. There was a large tract of land that had been used as a bombing range in World War II for Air Force training, I believe. And after World War II, my grandparents bought a portion of it, and a portion of it became a timber tract that was in the lowlands. And so my father and his brother, they always leased the hunting rights to the Edward Swamp and used it as a deer hunting club in that part of the county. And I would look for arrowheads on the farm, and then whenever they would timber a new tract in Edward Swamp, we would go down and walk across the timber tract, and wherever they timbered, there were artifacts there. There was pottery, there were arrowheads and flakes, and it was just a wonderful place to grow up. And so whenever I had spare time, me and my youngest sister would, on Sunday afternoon, it was our regular thing to hop in the truck after Sunday dinner and go down into the swamp and look for arrowheads and pottery. Whether it was the heat of the summer or snow falling in the winter, that was our Sunday afternoon thing to do. So. And Edward Swamp eventually, as you know, was picked up as part of the state's Heritage Trust program, and it was acquired, I think, primarily for its botanical resources as a river bottomland tract, and not for its historical or archaeological resources. But that kind of blossomed later in the course of history, and it became known as much for its historical resources and archaeological resources as it was for its botanical resources.
So tell us about your first encounter with Gene Waddell.
Well, I had been collecting arrowheads and pottery for a while, and I couldn't find anyone who could tell me anything about these. There wasn't a lot of material published on South Carolina archaeology, and there was at the Florence Museum, Eugene Waddell was the director in the late 60s, early 70s, I believe, and it was when the Archaeological Society of South Carolina and the South Carolina Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology were first being established, and they were doing outreach into various communities throughout the state and contacting people who had knowledge of local archaeological resources. And in the Florence area was Eugene Waddell, who was the director of the Florence Museum. I think James Mitchie was from that area. And Dr. Robert Stevenson had done an outreach there and started a local society in the late 60s, early 70s. And so one day I just thought, well, maybe there's someone at the museum who could tell me about this stuff. So I took in a collection of arrowheads and a collection of various potsherds I had found. And Eugene Waddell took an entire afternoon, and he sat down and he went over this collection, and I was just amazed to find out that there was all this information inherent in this pottery according to the decoration and how it was tempered and how it was made. You could tell a lot about when it was made and the cultures that produced them, and that was a just a, it was a huge enlightenment, like a light bulb going off. And so he insisted that I join the Archaeological Society of South Carolina. He introduced me to the Institute in Columbia. He pulled out a stack of site survey forms and he said, "You're going to fill these out this afternoon before you leave here." And so I filled out site survey forms on the various sites that I had that I knew of and sent them into Columbia. And that began a very long-lasting relationship with the people at the Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology. So there was kind of a long hiatus there. Once I went off to college and was involved in other things, it was about probably 25 years before I came back to the Institute after my parents died. When I approached you about doing some survey work at the Edwards Tract, the Great PD Heritage Trust Preserve.
Now, tell us, right before that, I believe you came to Archaeology Field Day at Santee State Park?
I did. I came down and I met Nina Rice for the first time, and it was the beginning of a long and fruitful friendship, one of my best friends. And I brought some potsherds I had found all over eastern Darlington County, this pottery that looked like Stallings Island fiber tempered pottery, which is a very distinctive type of pottery. It's the earliest pottery made in North Carolina, and all the text said that it was found along the coast of South Carolina. So Tommy Charles was doing artifact identification, and I showed him these Stallings Island sherds and this beautiful Tom's Creek punctate incised wares, just beautiful ceramics, and which also were reported as being along the coast. And he said, "Where did you find these? Along the coast?" And I said, "No, along the upper reaches of the Great PD River in Darlington County." And he said, "Well, that's not surprising." And I said, "Well, the texts say that it occurs along the coast." And he says, "Well, if no one is ever looking for something, they're not going to find it." But of course, these things went up the river valleys. And that too was kind of a light bulb. There'd never been a lot of significant archaeological research done in the PD region, or for that matter, in much of South Carolina. There had been a lot done in North Carolina in the early 20th century. There'd been a lot done in Georgia, and everybody sort of assumed that South Carolina was kind of a mixture of the two, which wasn't necessarily true. So that when he said that, I had always had an affinity for this site, which was the Johannes Kolb Site, primarily because of the prehistoric ceramics there and these beautiful Tom's Creek punctate wares. And I knew it was a rich site. I knew it was a good site, and I always envisioned archaeologists working at that site. I knew it would be a great site. But when he said that, that was the beginning, I think, of a light bulb going off that said, maybe you can find some way to work with the Institute of Archaeology and have some work done at that site. I had approached Dr. Stevenson about it in the late 60s, early 70s. And of course, then the states didn't have a whole lot of resources to devote to archaeological research. And he wrote me a nice letter encouraging me to record sites. But that was about as far as it was able to go then. But, in the 90s, late 90s, when I approached you about doing some survey work there, and particularly looking at that site, that's how it all sort of began.
Tell
so
us
there are a lot of people who who've been kind of involved in setting the stage for that Johannes Corp site, Eugene Waddell and Tommy Charles and you and Diachronic and Carl Steen and the Institute. So I've had a great time with it, being able to play with all the archaeologists for many years there in Darlington County. So
let's take one step back. I think at some point, Horace Rudisill in the Darlington County Historical Commission had called your attention to Johannes Kolb?
Actually, no. There was a book, the Darlington County Historical Society in the 1950s published a book called Darlingtoniana, and it was a lot of different papers that had been presented over the years through the Darlington County Historical Society of various aspects of Darlington history. And one of those papers, they had a plat of Bird's Island, and just across the old riverbed from Bird's Island, there was a little house, and it said Johannes, old Mr. Kolb's house, I believe is what it said on the plat. And it was done by a surveyor, Mr. T.E. Wilson in Darlington County, who was a wonderful surveyor back in the early 20th century in the teens and 20s and 30s. And many of his survey plats, whenever there was a historical association that occurred on that property, he would include that in his survey plat. And many of his surveys, they look sort of like the map of Yoknapatawpha County in William Faulkner's books. That's, it says Mr. Sartorius died here and so happened here. And so they have a wealth of historical information. But that site the Johannes Kolb site had been timbered in the early 70s, and I visited it. And in addition to the prehistoric artifacts, there was a fair amount of colonial stuff, slipware and different early colonial ceramics. I couldn't find anything about those. I went to the Darlington County Library, and they actually had a book on archaeological work done in Eastern Canada at some site, and it had all these 18th century ceramics, and it was the same stuff that I was finding at the Johannes Kolb site. And that's when I stumbled across that plat, and I said, this must be where Mr. Kolb was. Now, my grandparents were not from Darlington County. Their people were from Lancaster County, and they moved there in the 30s. And that's sort of important in that I did not realize at the time that Mr. Kolb was one of the first European settlers in Darlington County. He came in with a lot of children who married the children of a lot of the other first settlers there, so that by 1861, just about every planter family in that part of South Carolina descended from Mr. Kolb, and their descendants today know that they're descended from Mr. Kolb. And so there's that strong tie to this home site among all of these people in Eastern South Carolina, and now all across the United States, wherever you see Kolbs, and whether it's spelled K-O-L-B or C-U-L-P, these people, a significant number of them descend from Johannes Kolb. And I sort of wonder in my my answer, but I'm not sure if that answered the question there.
That's great. Well, tell us about your invitation for an invasion of archaeologists into your small community in Darlington County.
We know we lost. I have three sisters. We grew up in Eastern Darlington County on this wonderful farm, and both of our parents died within about 12 weeks of each other in 1996. And our father just absolutely loved this piece of property, and I spent a lot of time with him there growing up. And so I thought after it was acquired by the Heritage Trust as a Heritage Trust Preserve, I wanted to do something kind of to memorialize them. And so I asked around, and I finally got directed to your office. I don't remember exactly how, but they said, Chris Judge is the person you need to talk to. He's the archaeologist for the Department of Natural Resources. And so I approached you about doing just primarily some general survey work on the site. But what I was primarily interested in was the Johannes Kolb site and one or two other sites on the property. So you guys agreed to come out. And as I say, you weren't from here, so you thought August was a wonderful time to come out and poke around the Petey River Swamp for a couple of weeks, and so you guys came out, and you actually, it was a relatively small crew that first season, and you stayed with, I believe, my sister and her husband in Dillon County, Latta,
yeah.
South Carolina, L-A-T-T-A, Latta. And so there was this official state truck with these guys with shovels that were leaving at dawn every morning and coming back at dusk covered in mud and dirty and begrimed. And apparently the word around the community was that you were going around destroying everyone's marijuana fields. So they had not had much experience with archaeologists, but it was a fairly, it turned out to be a fairly rich site. And you guys thought it deserved some additional attention, and so you came back the following year at a more appropriate time over spring break for the university in late February, early March, and that became an annual event. And it was just a it was a very, very rich site. So, and the other thing that intrigued me about this site is there were all these shell middens, all these mussel shells, and I knew that was typical along the coast, but not so much. It had not been described so much in that part of South Carolina, and so there.
Turn the water off.
Okay. So I'm sorry.
Well, let me dive in here. Let me dive in here and tell our listeners that we ended up staying for 20 years, coming out 20 years every March, spring break for USC and the week after, and I found it to be like a harmonic convergence that, we had this wonderful site. we had Kirk Dunlap and Campbell Cox offer us hunting lodges to stay in, which I think was a big part of the project, and it saved us, tens and tens of thousands of dollars in hotel costs. I remember the first couple of years, you convinced your neighbors in the community to invite, at times, 20 archaeologists, who some of which had showered and some of which hadn't, to come into their homes for dinner. And what we found was that the community was just incredibly welcoming. Many of them were descendants from Joannis and Sarah Kolb and their 9 children. If we needed a water pump, a farmer would drop it at Weatherford's gas station and a convenience store in the morning and tell us, just bring it back when you're done. When it was flooded and we needed to get in by boat, people would show up. Your cousin, Curly Campbell, would show up with boats and ferry us into the site, which I believe was about a 40-minute round trip, 20 minutes up and 20 minutes back each day. But it just turned out to be a wonderful project, and we got to train students. We had opportunity to work with avocational archaeologists, and I think it's a model project. I'm not tooting my own horn. There's so many people involved, but a great opportunity for South Carolina archaeology. Let me shift gears here a little bit and ask you another question. How can professional archaeologists better serve the interested public? We like to think we're public archaeologists, and you got to meet 2 great ones. Tommy Charles and Nina Rice have done this fantastic outreach over the years, 2 just incredibly wonderful personalities who I think could talk to anyone about any subject, and easygoing, down to earth. And but you've been kind of on the sidelines, and now are jumping in maybe fully into it. But how do we better serve the public? Folks like yourself, when you were.
Yeah, I think, I think the Kolb Site is a wonderful model, and I think it was successful for a number of reasons. I mean, it's accessibility and making knowledge accessible, and getting kids outside. And South Carolina is changing rapidly. The country is changing rapidly. There aren't many kids who are able at the age of 7 or 8 to hop in a truck and drive 5 miles down into a state preserve, and whenever they want to go looking for arrowheads and that sort of thing. And it's changing, and kids do not have as much of a connection with the land, and as fewer families are involved in farming, and so you're losing a lot of that connection and a lot of that knowledge of sites. But I think the Kolb Site was really successful for a number of unique reasons. Number one, it was a protected property in perpetuity, so there wasn't a rush to do it all at once. It's not salvage archaeology. You're able to do it in a very deliberate and methodical manner, and you were able to plan season after season with a formal public invitation. You welcome public volunteers at no cost. The public support, because of this genealogical connection with Johannes Kolb, was a big driver of a lot of that. And you had all of this public support, which provided a lot of resources to you. You had incredible support from the surrounding Native American tribes, and so that you didn't have that, which at times can be, I'm sure, very frustrating, tension between Native American descendants and professional archaeologists. So all of these things kind of played in together. But the public day and the commitment you made to public education. I mean, every year you would have someone like Tarkapar, dedicated to the public education. And you had materials and exhibits and displays, and people were welcome to walk around that site and walk around these excavation pits. And sometimes, for instance, that first public day when the PD River was at record flood stage, and we put hundreds of people in small boats and took them up the river to the site. In hindsight, probably wasn't the safest thing to do, but it was, it was always exciting for people. And you had different groups of visitors. Some would come every year. You had some that might come every 3 years, and people would kind of cycle through there over time. But it really became a tradition there in Darlington County through the 90s and early 2000s until it wrapped up. I think the main thing is accessibility, having information available to the public, because just about everyone's interested in their past and in prehistory. It's just hard to find information, and so having sites that are being and you always worry when you're excavating a site. You worry about pot hunters and looters and damage to the site and this sort of thing. But on the other hand, whenever you have an opportunity to invite people into a project and to interact with the archaeologists, and particularly school-age kids, because that's when you're really laying down the foundation for the future, and making it accessible to people, and not only people who are going to go on to have to study and have careers as professional archaeologists, but people who are going to be accountants and physicians and lawyers, because you never know when that's going to come back to help the archaeological community. And the other thing I think is really important is recording these sites and letting the public know. If you know of a site, you should have it recorded with the Institute properly and formally, so that information is not lost, because the state is developing very rapidly, and these sites are being lost rapidly. So I think that's the other important part of it.
That's a good answer. So what are you involved in these days? I know you've been on the board of the Archaeological Research Trust of the Institute of Archaeology, and I believe right now you're on the board of the Archaeos Cultural Heritage and Archaeology Film Festival, which is just a few weeks ago. How'd that go?
And that just finished, and they had a lot of wonderful films. The one I liked the best, didn't place at all, was the one on the Roman roads. But it's a great opportunity. I mean, these are beautiful documentaries, and they're very fascinating films, and they usually have at least one that deals with South Carolina history and archaeology. And it's every fall. And this past year, we went to a online format instead of an in-person format because of the COVID pandemic, and I suspect next year may be the same. But people should look into the Archaeos, ARKHAIOS Film Festival website, and it's free of charge, and you get to see some wonderful documentary films. And so stay posted. It's usually in the fall in South Carolina. So I'm doing that right now. COVID has kind of shut everything down. It's kind of brought things. So one thing I've been trying to get going, and hopefully with cooler weather here, once you began work at the Kolb Site, it became apparent to me how many sites in South Carolina were recorded in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and now they are deemed non-locatable because they weren't recorded using current GPS data and whatever. And so I talked with John Leader about pulling those non-locatable site reports and going around the state and see how many of those can actually be located and have those sites properly documented. So that's the biggest thing I'm trying to get going here. The other thing, we talked about possible pursuing some postgraduate work on my own with the Institute, and that's kind of floating around the universe there. So
Hopefully we can get out from under the COVID cloud and you can get on the road with your recording. I think that the non-locatable project sounds like a really good one, because there are a lot of sites, in those days they accepted a site form with incomplete information. They don't do that anymore. Mm-hmm. So there are a lot of sites that probably do need to be checked on again, assessed. It may have been 30, 40 years since they've been assessed. So any final words?
Only, kudos to you and Carl Steen for a spectacular 20-year project. That was one of the other things I said was fortunate for the Johannes Kolb Site, is that it was conducted by two archaeologists who were young enough to work for 20 years and healthy enough to last for 20 years. And you guys, I think, really, you really wrote the book on public archaeology. I think you are a textbook example for anyone in the world to look at how you conducted that project and welcomed the public in and educated the public with the Johannes Kolb Site, and the sheer number of people who contributed to that site, the sheer number of people who benefited from that site in terms of studying their professional archaeologists and other disciplines. It was just really an honor to be involved with that. So,
Well, Chip, if it hadn't been for you, that never would have happened. And you funded us, you encouraged us, you fed us, you housed us, and we're often behind the scenes playing an important role that a lot of people probably thought it was us that was running the project, but you were behind the scenes, and your sister Mary Ellen and your brother-in-law David, were just fantastic to us. And so, man, thanks for doing an interview today. It's been great to talk to you. And once again, everyone, I've been talking today with Chip Helms from Darlington County, and thanks so much for doing the interview, and we'll get this up online soon.
Always a pleasure.